Hello and welcome to Cognitive Drift. Man is condemned to be free. Those words from Jean-Paul Sartre carry a weight that many of us underestimate. Freedom sounds like a gift, but it also comes with responsibility, and responsibility is something many people run from. Instead, they look for certainty, structure, and a ready-made map of meaning. That's where religion steps in, and that's where its most powerful tactics begin. Let's start with something simple. Humans hate uncertainty. Our brains are wired to seek patterns, predict outcomes, and avoid chaos. In moments of fear or confusion, certainty feels like oxygen. Religion offers that certainty wrapped in absolute truths. It says, this is the way, the only way, everything else is wrong. That level of confidence is seductive because it quiets doubt. But this isn't about truth, it's about control. If you can convince someone that questioning equals danger, you've already taken the first step in brainwashing them. The first tactic most religions use is isolation through language. Words shape thought. If you've ever noticed how certain groups invent their own vocabulary, words like sin, blessed, saved, or unbeliever, that's not random. It creates an in-group and an out-group. People start thinking in terms of us and them without realizing it. And when your entire moral compass is locked to these terms, breaking out feels like losing your identity. That's how deep this conditioning goes. Then comes repetition. Psychologists know that repeated statements start to feel true over time. It's called the illusory truth effect. Religion mastered this long before psychology gave it a name. Repeating prayers daily, hearing sermons weekly, reading sacred texts constantly. It isn't just ritual, it's reinforcement. Over years, those ideas carve grooves into the mind so deep that alternative perspectives barely register. And when people believe something without ever considering its opposite, it doesn't feel like belief anymore, it feels like reality. But control isn't only about repetition, it's about emotion. Fear is one of the strongest levers in human psychology. Fear of death, fear of punishment, fear of being cast out. Religions weaponize fear by inventing eternal consequences. Think about it. You could tell someone, be good, it makes life better. Or you could say, if you disobey, you'll suffer forever. Which one grabs harder? Which one makes someone obey even when no one's watching? That's not morality. That's surveillance, without cameras. And it's brilliant in a sinister way. What's even more effective than fear? Love. When you mix fear with love, you create a psychological trap called trauma bonding. Religions teach that a divine figure loves you unconditionally, but that same figure will punish you eternally if you step out of line. It's the ultimate abusive relationship. Threat and affection in one package. When people internalize this, leaving the system feels like betraying the one who loves them most. That's why even logical arguments rarely work on believers, because you're not just asking them to change ideas, you're asking them to break an emotional bond. And here's where the tactic becomes almost elegant. People are taught to police themselves. Instead of external enforcement, religion installs an internal monitor, a voice that whispers guilt and shame every time you stray. This self-surveillance is so effective that even after someone leaves a religion, those feelings linger. That's not faith, that's conditioning. And conditioning, when strong enough, can feel indistinguishable from free choice. Another tool religions use is what psychologists call thought stopping. Whenever doubt creeps in, believers are taught to crush it with pre-approved responses. Have faith. God works in mysterious ways. The devil is tempting you. These phrases sound harmless, but they shut down critical thinking. The conversation ends before it begins, and over time, people lose the muscle for questioning because every attempt has been trained to collapse under a weight of slogans. But maybe the most dangerous tactic is monopolizing meaning. Humans need purpose. Without it, life can feel unbearable. Religion steps in and says, here's your purpose, here's why you exist, here's what happens when you die. That promise is intoxicating because it takes away the hardest questions we face. The price? You surrender the freedom to find your own answers. You trade your uncertainty for a prepackaged story. And once you've invested your entire identity in that story, walking away feels like erasing yourself. Now let's look at why these tactics work so well. They're not random. They align perfectly with cognitive biases. Confirmation bias makes people seek evidence that supports their beliefs and ignore what challenges them. Authority bias makes them trust leaders who seem confident. The sunk cost fallacy makes them double down because they've already invested so much time, money, relationships, reputation. This isn't a flaw of a few people. It's a flaw in human nature, and religion exploits it with precision. Once those psychological levers are in place, the next move is social reinforcement. Humans are tribal creatures. We crave belonging because, in our evolutionary past, isolation meant death. Religion leverages that instinct brilliantly. It builds tight-knit communities where identity is tied to shared beliefs. People don't just attend services, they build their entire social life around them. Friends, family, even business networks often come from the same religious circle. Which means questioning the doctrine doesn't just threaten your beliefs, it threatens your entire support system. This creates what sociologists call a total environment. In such a system, everything from morality to daily habits flows from the same source. What you eat, what you wear, who you marry, all controlled by a single set of rules. That's not accidental. It's strategic, because the more areas of life a system governs, the harder it is to step outside without collapsing your entire identity. People aren't just rejecting ideas, they're risking exile from their world. And here's the twist. When you do manage to leave, the programming often follows you. Many ex-believers report feeling phantom guilt years after leaving, like a ghost of control still haunting their choices. That's what deep conditioning looks like. It isn't a matter of intelligence. Brilliant minds have fallen for it. It's a matter of emotional leverage, social entanglement, and psychological hooks that run deeper than reason. Another tactic worth examining is indoctrination from childhood. No other stage of life is as vulnerable as early childhood. At that age, critical thinking isn't developed yet. A child trusts authority figures completely. When those figures say, "This is the truth," the child absorbs it as reality, not opinion. This is why so many religions target education systems, control school curricula, or set up faith-based schools. Teach a child early, and the foundation becomes so rigid that later doubts feel like acts of betrayal rather than intellectual curiosity. And what about rituals? They might look harmless, lighting candles, reciting prayers, singing hymns. But rituals do more than create tradition. They reinforce belonging and emotional connection. Every time you repeat a ritual, you strengthen the neural pathway linked to that belief. It's like rehearsal, except what you're practicing is submission. Combine that with group participation, and you get a psychological phenomenon called collective effervescence. A surge of shared emotion that feels almost transcendental. People mistake that feeling for proof that their faith is real, when in reality, it's a well-documented effect of synchronized activity. One of the most subtle forms of brainwashing is controlling information. Historically, religions restricted access to texts, keeping sacred writings in languages ordinary people couldn't read, like Latin or Sanskrit. Why? Because if you control interpretation, you control belief. Even today, some groups discourage reading outside literature, labeling alternative sources as dangerous. This creates an echo chamber where the only truth available is the one approved by authority. It's no different from how cults operate, except on a much larger scale. Speaking of cults, people often think cults and mainstream religions are completely different, but the core mechanisms are the same. Isolation, thought control, fear, love bombing, and us versus them mentality. The only difference is scale and social acceptance. When a cult does it, we call it manipulation. When a major religion does it, we call it tradition. That double standard exists because the tactics have been normalized over centuries. Familiarity makes the extraordinary seem ordinary. Let's go deeper into fear because it deserves more attention. Fear of eternal punishment isn't just a metaphor, it's a psychological weapon. Studies show that belief in hell correlates with higher anxiety and lower happiness, and yet, it persists because fear-based control is extremely effective. If you can convince someone that the stakes are infinite, No evidence is needed. The fear alone becomes self-sustaining. And here's the chilling part. Children are often taught these fears before they even understand what death means. That's not guidance. That's imprinting terror at a formative age. Now you might ask, why do intelligent people fall for this? The answer lies in cognitive dissonance. Once someone invests deeply in a belief system, the mind resists information that contradicts it. Not because the evidence is weak, but because changing beliefs would shatter their identity. So instead of facing that pain, people double down. They reinterpret evidence, twist logic, or avoid the topic altogether. This isn't stupidity, it's a defense mechanism, and religion counts on it. Finally, there's the promise of reward. Eternal paradise, reincarnation into a better life, spiritual enlightenment. These promises create a bias psychologists call deferred reward justification. It's the same mechanism that makes people tolerate miserable conditions because a better future is coming. Religion exploits this by shifting happiness out of reach, always tied to compliance, always postponed to the next life, that keeps people obedient in this one. You might wonder, with all this knowledge about psychology and critical thinking widely available today, why do these tactics still work? Why haven't they collapsed under the weight of modern science and reason? The answer is that these strategies aren't just old, they're adaptive. Religion evolves just like any other system designed for survival. When societies modernize, religions don't vanish, they rebrand. They trade fire and brimstone sermons for soft language about personal growth and community values. The tactics remain, but the packaging changes to fit the culture. For example, fear of eternal damnation might sound outdated, so some groups replace it with social shame. Instead of "you'll burn forever," the message becomes "if you leave, you'll lose your purpose, you'll be lost." And that's not an idle threat, because the social cost is real. Ostracism, family fractures, even job loss in some communities. That's how deeply the roots go. Fear doesn't always wear the mask of supernatural punishment. Sometimes it hides behind the threat of loneliness. Religions also exploit what marketers call scarcity. They make belonging feel rare and precious. We have the ultimate truth. Everyone else is blind. Scarcity creates urgency, and urgency pushes people to cling tighter to what they think they might lose. Add in rituals like fasting, tithing, and acts of devotion, and you get another psychological effect, sunk cost bias. The more people invest emotionally, financially, physically, the harder it is to walk away, because if you leave after sacrificing so much, what does that say about your choices? Governments and institutions have long understood the usefulness of these mechanisms. Authoritarian regimes throughout history have aligned themselves with religious authority because it offers something raw power alone cannot: legitimacy. When a ruler claims divine approval, obedience stops being political and becomes sacred. People will tolerate poverty, injustice, even war, if they believe their suffering has cosmic meaning. This isn't speculation, it's written in history. From the pharaohs of Egypt to European monarchs to modern theocracies, religion has been a tool for consolidating control because it shapes hearts and minds in ways brute force never could. And what's the cost of all this? The cost isn't just personal, it's societal. When critical thinking is stifled, innovation suffers. When morality is outsourced to authority, people stop taking responsibility for their choices. Entire populations can be swayed to commit atrocities if they believe they're acting under divine command. Think of the Crusades, the Inquisition, witch hunts, or more recent examples where violence was justified as holy. These aren't isolated mistakes, they're predictable outcomes when obedience is valued over reason. On the personal level, the cost can be devastating. People waste years or entire lives living by rules that were never theirs. They give up careers, relationships, and dreams because those things don't fit a script someone else wrote. And the tragedy is that many never realize it. They live and die without ever knowing how much freedom they surrendered for an illusion of safety. But here's something rarely discussed: the lingering psychological grip, even after someone leaves. Former believers often describe a period of intense guilt, anxiety, even panic attacks. This is called religious trauma syndrome. It happens because leaving doesn't erase the mental framework that was built over decades. It's like uninstalling software, but leaving behind fragments of code that still affect how the system runs. People find themselves questioning every decision, fearing unseen punishment, or feeling empty because the old story is gone and nothing has replaced it yet. Yet there's another side to this. Breaking free from those tactics can be one of the most liberating experiences a person can have, but it's not easy. It requires unlearning habits of thought, reclaiming autonomy, and often rebuilding life from scratch. It means facing uncertainty without flinching, and that's terrifying for many, but it's also the first real taste of freedom, the kind Sartre was talking about, the kind that comes not from surrendering to authority, but from owning your existence fully. And here's the irony. Religion promises freedom but sells dependency. It promises truth but punishes questions. It promises love but conditions it on obedience. Once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it. And once you recognize the tactics, fear, isolation, repetition, emotional control, social pressure, they lose some of their power. Because brainwashing only works when it stays invisible, shine a light on it, and the spell begins to break. So what does life look like after the spell is broken? It's not always easy. There's no ready-made script, no cosmic safety net, no eternal scoreboard, and that can feel terrifying at first. But it's also exhilarating, because meaning isn't something handed down, it's something you create. And when you create it yourself, no one can take it from you. That's real security, not the kind based on threats or promises, but the kind rooted in understanding reality as it is. And maybe that's the ultimate takeaway. These tactics work because they exploit fear. Fear of death, fear of uncertainty, fear of being alone. The antidote isn't more fear, it's courage. Courage to ask hard questions, courage to live without guarantees, courage to build a life that's truly yours. No authority, no scripture, no invisible judge. Just you, this moment, and the freedom to choose what it means. We've covered the big levers: fear, repetition, social control. But some of the most fascinating tactics are subtle, almost invisible. They don't look like brainwashing because they blend so naturally into culture that questioning them feels absurd. Let's start with one: cognitive priming. Cognitive priming is the process of preparing the mind to interpret future experiences in a certain way. Religion does this masterfully. From childhood, people are told everything good comes from God, everything bad comes from disobedience. So when something fortunate happens, they interpret it as divine favor. When tragedy strikes, it's a test or a punishment. This isn't evidence, it's framing. And framing is powerful because once you accept the lens, everything you see reinforces the narrative. It's a closed loop disguised as meaning. Another overlooked tactic is identity fusion. This is when personal identity becomes inseparable from group identity. In other words, I am my faith. This isn't just belonging, it's merging. Once that fusion happens, attacking the belief feels like attacking the person. That's why debates rarely work, because you're not challenging ideas anymore, you're triggering a fight or flight response. The brain reacts as if under physical threat, and when survival is on the line, reason takes a back seat. And there's martyrdom psychology. Religions often glorify suffering for the cause, whether through fasting, celibacy, or even death. Why? Because suffering creates investment. If you've endured hardship for something, you need to believe it's worth it. That's the sunk cost bias again, but with a moral twist. The harder the sacrifice, the stronger the loyalty. People will defend a belief system to the death, not because it's true, but because their pain demands a payoff. And if the reward is eternal bliss, no earthly evidence can compete. Music and art also play a role that's easy to underestimate. Neuroscience shows that music bypasses rational filters and taps straight into emotion. That's why religious ceremonies often involve rhythmic chanting, powerful melodies, and visual grandeur. Cathedrals, temples, stained glass, incense. It's a full sensory experience. And here's the kicker. The awe you feel in those moments gets misattributed. You think it's proof of the divine, but it's your brain responding to stimuli designed to overwhelm it. The environment creates the emotion, and the doctrine claims the credit. Propaganda scholars have long noted that repetition, authority, and emotional appeal are the pillars of persuasion. Religion checks all three boxes, but it adds a fourth: timelessness. It claims its truths are eternal, outside of history, immune to evidence, that puts it beyond debate. And when something can't be questioned, it becomes untouchable. Even when it shapes laws, controls education, and dictates morality, that's not just belief, that's power wrapped in sanctity. Now, let's draw the parallel most people avoid: religion and cults. The line people draw between the two is arbitrary. Call something a cult and everyone sees manipulation. Call it a religion and suddenly it's faith. But strip away the labels and compare the methods. Isolation, us versus them thinking. Charismatic leaders. Punishment for dissent, promise of ultimate reward. It's the same playbook scaled up and normalized over centuries. If a small group in the desert demands loyalty and obedience, we call it brainwashing. If a billion people do it under ornate architecture, we call it tradition. The only difference is PR and time. And this normalization matters because it hides the harm. People assume that because something is widespread, it must be benign. But popularity has never been proof of truth, only proof of efficiency. And religion has been efficient for millennia because it hijacks fundamental human needs: certainty, belonging, and meaning. Needs so primal that when they're threatened, people will fight, kill, even die to protect them. That's the level of psychological entanglement we're talking about. Let's be clear. This isn't about demonizing individuals who believe most are sincere, trying to live good lives. The issue isn't sincerity. It's the system that exploits vulnerability and calls it virtue. A system that convinces people that obedience equals goodness, that doubt equals danger, that their own mind can't be trusted without external authority. That's not spiritual guidance, that's mental colonization. And here's something rarely discussed: the economic angle. Religion often demands financial contributions framed as gifts or tithes. Over time, these contributions fund massive institutions that perpetuate the cycle. Wealth concentrates at the top, while followers are told poverty is virtuous. This is classic power economics dressed in sacred language. And because it's tied to salvation, questioning it feels like risking your soul. That's not generosity, that's leverage. By now, the pattern should be clear. Every tactic, from fear to identity fusion to aesthetic awe, serves one goal: control. Not always maliciously, not always consciously, but control nonetheless. And control, once internalized, becomes self-perpetuating. People teach their children the same systems that once controlled them, thinking they're offering security. And the cycle spins on, century after century. When you pull back and look at the full picture, what stands out isn't just how these tactics work. It's how natural they feel once you're inside the system. That's what makes them so effective. Brainwashing doesn't feel like brainwashing when it's wrapped in comfort, beauty, and promises of eternal happiness. It feels like truth. And that's the genius of it. Control disguised as care, obedience framed as virtue, fear masked as love. The question is, why does it matter? If someone finds comfort in these systems, why not let them be? Here's why: because the cost isn't just personal, it shapes societies. It influences laws about who people can marry, what women can do with their bodies, what children are allowed to learn in schools. It decides whether science gets funded or censored, whether entire populations are prepared for the future or shackled to the past. It's not just private belief, it's public power. And when that power is built on psychological control rather than informed choice, it deserves scrutiny. There's also the matter of truth itself. We live in an age where evidence matters for everything: medicine, technology, justice. Yet for some reason, when it comes to the biggest questions, why are we here, what happens after we die, many people accept answers that have no evidence at all. That double standard isn't harmless. It teaches people that faith can override facts, that feeling can outweigh thinking. And once that habit takes root, it doesn't stay confined to religion, it spreads to politics, science denial, conspiracy thinking, because the moment you glorify belief without evidence, you open the door to every kind of manipulation. And maybe the deepest reason it matters is this: autonomy. The freedom to think, to question, to choose your own meaning. When you outsource that to an institution or a doctrine, you give away the most human part of yourself. Not because someone forced you at gunpoint, but because they convinced you it was righteous. That's what makes these tactics so dangerous. They don't just control actions, they shape identity. And when identity is hijacked, the chains don't even look like chains anymore. But here's the truth no system wants you to know. Life without those chains isn't empty. It's real. Yes, it's uncertain. Yes, it lacks cosmic guarantees, but it's yours. Every joy, every failure, every choice belongs to you. And that kind of freedom is terrifying at first, but it's also exhilarating. Because meaning that you create for yourself is stronger than any borrowed promise. It's not fragile because it doesn't depend on someone else's authority. It lives in your own understanding, your own experience. There's a quote often attributed to the philosopher Epictetus: "No man is free who is not master of himself." That mastery doesn't come from surrendering to a system. It comes from reclaiming your mind, questioning what you've been taught, and daring to walk without the crutch of certainty. That's the opposite of brainwashing. It's brain awakening. And in a world where so many forces compete for control over what we think and believe, maybe the most radical act is to stop letting anyone own your thoughts. Not a preacher, not a book, not a tradition. No one. So the next time you hear a claim that demands obedience, that punishes doubt, that frames freedom as danger, pause. Ask yourself, is this guidance, or is this control dressed up as truth? Because once you see the pattern, it's impossible to unsee. And when enough people recognize it, maybe the world finally moves one step closer to what religion has always promised, but never delivered. Real freedom, not the kind written in sacred texts, the kind that starts the moment you take your mind back.